Welcome. I'm Michael Pierce, and this is The Human Condition. Today's topic is, which diet should I follow? This is a loaded question because I've been asked this question all the time. The problem is, there is usually no single diet that works for the type of patients that present to me. The type of patients that present to me have complex problems and complex needs, family histories, and lifestyle decisions to make, and they have to usually cram 3 or 4 diets into one. So what I want to talk about today is how to figure that out, because you can't just go to a doctor and have them tell you what to eat. You have to figure it out yourself with the help of a doctor. I'm going to tell you how that works today. When a person goes to a doctor, they usually go to a doctor for diet help for a reason. And that reason is often some symptom or some problem that they have that they want to control. It could be as simple as weight loss and better sleep or stress management, or it could be something specific like a thyroid problem or a seizure disorder or skin rash or fertility or any number of problems that a person's trying to deal with. And so the most common diets that I find I have to merge with people and no one has ever put together before is this combination of diets. The first thing that people need to look at, in my experience, is insulin resistance and carbs. Most of them have too high a carb ratio in their diet, comparing carbs to proteins and fats. So the first thing we do is we tell them, try to lower your carb ratio and raise your proteins and fats, and you have to decide whether you're going to do a low-carb, high-fat diet, which is different than a ketogenic diet, which is different than a carnivore diet. And so my first question of the patient is, which one do you want to do? So then I have to educate them about each of those diets, and they have to do a little reading on their own and find out that there's a difference in those ratios. There's a difference in ease of use. Perhaps the most fast diet would be the ketogenic diet for getting results in many cases, but there are dirty ketogenic diets that are full of grains and full of other types of foods that are not extremely useful for getting better. So a person could go on a full keto diet, but they might eat all kinds of keto snacks that are not going to help them with their lectins, for example. So they might be able to do a ketogenic diet, but they're not properly measuring their ketones. They may be measuring their ketones in urine, which is not very useful. Ketones in urine are not accurate after the first day, and you need to use blood. So I first advise them to start getting a ketone meter and measuring their blood twice a day, and looking for ketones and blood sugar at least twice a day. Now, the strips cost $1 a piece, and you have to use one and throw it away every time. The lancets that pierce your skin are $1 a piece, and they have to be thrown away every time. And you probably have to do 2 of those a day, so that's $4 a day, 2 lancets, 2 strips. And the ketone meter isn't very expensive. They're like $20 at every pharmacy. But you don't want to just get a glucose meter. You want to get a glucose meter that's also a ketone meter, and you want to make sure it measures blood, and it gives you the right units. Now, in most cases, we're looking at between 0.5 and 3 units, or 1 to 3 units of ketones, which is the way the device measures things. And that's what we're looking for. We also want to poke the skin of the toes on the side of each of the toes. We don't want to poke the pad of the skin of the fingers or the toes. And if we can avoid fingers, it'd be nice if we could use toes instead, because you get more blood flow from your toes because your toes are below your heart. So you can bend over and poke your toe, and you've got that nice blood flow coming out. And it hurts less too. So use the side of the finger instead of the pad of the side of the finger and toe instead of the pad. Once you're into a diet, you've got to weigh the different factors. Now you've decided that you're going to do some kind of low-carb-ish diet. And your next factor is, well, do I need to eliminate plant lectins? And most of you will have to. You don't need to eliminate all of them, but you'll need to find out which ones they are, and there's no test for it. So you have to do your own elimination diet. So if you come to me and say, which foods can I eat or can't eat, I'm going to say, I don't know. We can use your blood type to narrow it down, but that doesn't always work. It's very useful, but it's not the only way to do it, and there's no blood test for it. You might say, well, doc, I found a lab that does test for antibodies to lectins. Well, that doesn't matter because lectins don't require an antibody to stick to your intestines and cause problems. So an antibody test is useful. If you have a positive antibody test to a lectin, then for sure you don't want to eat that lectin. But if you have a negative, it could very well be a false negative in that you don't form an antibody to that food lectin, but it could still just as well attach to your intestinal lining and cause irritation and cause all the different problems that all the doctors talk about. So the only way to know is to do an elimination diet, and that might take 2 or 3 weeks of eliminating a food or a class of foods and then adding them back in and seeing what happens. Now, you've heard me warn before, if you have an autoimmune disease or a seizure disorder or some other type of very fragile problem, you may not want to re-add those foods back in. You may just eliminate them until you feel a heck of a lot better and eliminate. The problem with elimination diets is most people end up saying, well, I did an elimination diet and I ended up eating chicken and rice. And that's what most people end up on, is they say, I could only eat chicken and rice. And so here's the 2 problems. There's no fat in that diet, because the chicken is usually, raw chicken breast, not raw, it's pure chicken breast cooked without any skin, and rice with no fat. So the person ends up with very limited diet and they don't get enough nutrients. So if you're going to do an elimination diet down to 0, you're going to probably end up on a carnivore diet, because it's the easiest way to eliminate most plant lectins and figure out what's messing you up if you're autoimmune. That means now we're combining some kind of low-carb, keto, or carnivore diet with a low-lectin diet. And so that means we don't want to get a lot of foods that have lectins. If you go to a bookstore and buy a cookbook, and you buy a wonderful ketogenic or low-carb, high-fat cookbook, it's going to be full of plants. It's going to be full of plants, and it's going to have a lot of oil and a lot of meat and a lot of protein, but it's going to have a lot of plants. And so you might not be able to use a lot of cookbooks out there. And so you'll have to pick and choose among the recipes and say, I like that one, I don't like that one. There's no one perfect book. There's no one perfect diet. You're going to have to figure it out, and you're going to have to interpret your symptoms and sometimes keep a log and take pictures of your meals and plates and talk to people like me about it to have us help you interpret your results on a regular basis. So I tell people, talk to me once a month, have an appointment, have a follow-up, and until you figure it out, and I'll help you sail through and smooth through that process. Another type of diet is the low-sulfur diet. Some people with certain SNPs and certain problems can't tolerate sulfur of a high level in their diet. So it doesn't mean they have to have a no-sulfur diet, because I don't know that a no-sulfur diet exists. Sulfur is in so many foods, but to varying degrees. So what you've got to do is for all these lists, we have to go online and you have to look up high whatever you're trying to avoid and low whatever you're trying to avoid lists. And you can do that very easily on the internet. You might have to look up high lectin, low lectin diets, high sulfur, low sulfur foods. And so now that you get what I'm talking about, we're going to cruise through and do the rest of that. You might be a person that reacts to histamine, and you have to look at high histamine, low histamine foods. You might be a person that has problems with salicylates. Salicylates are in certain foods like cherries and citrus fruits and other foods. And salicylates can set off behavior problems in children and some kind of allergy reactions. Some people have to avoid citric acid. Some children have to avoid oxalic acid or uric acid. If people get gout or pseudo-gout, they avoid uric acid or oxalic acid. If they have joint pains and body pains and eye pains, there are a number of autistic children that get eye pains and have to avoid oxalic acid. So with all these diets, we have to get a list and cross-reference all the different things that you may have to avoid. And luckily there are lab tests for this. You can do lab tests from Great Plains Laboratory or other laboratories that will test you for oxalates. You can get different tests for histamine metabolites. There are some 200 different histamine molecules that are talked about in the mast cell activation syndrome world. The mast cell activation syndrome, or the histamine and histamine-like substances, is where a person reacts to the substances that are made by mast cells in their own body that are triggered by foods. So you can eat foods that have high histamines, and you can have your own cells release histamine-like compounds, and there's over 200 of these compounds. So you can't just go get a histamine blood test and say, oh, I don't have a problem with histamine, so I don't have MCAS. So it's not that easy. You can avoid histamines by avoiding leftovers and by avoiding any food that sits for a while, because bacterial action on food makes it have more bacteria, which makes it have more histamine and histamine-like compounds. Unfortunately, fermented foods have a lot of histamine. So if you have a penchant for fermented foods that are otherwise considered very healthy, and yet you have mast cell activation syndrome, you might suffer. So you might not be able to have kefir, you might not be able to have yogurt, you might not be able to have sauerkraut, you might not be able to necessarily have kimchi, you might not be able to have kombucha, which is an otherwise very healthy food. So if you have these problems, you could be in a great deal of trouble. Another one is SIBO. There are SIBO food lists that have to avoid fibers and starches and sugars and lectins, and and certain bacteria. If you don't avoid all those, you can get small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So if you have a bunch of problems that are chronic, you're probably going to have to work with a doctor like me to help tailor a diet that weaves together and stitches together a quilt of the different diets. So you're going to be maybe lectin and low carb and low histamine and low oxalate because you've got joint pain and kidney stones and skin reactions and insulin resistance and overweight and high blood pressure. So you might have to have this diet that does all this. So if I cut to the chase, what's the easiest diet for that? Well, you may be worried and say, well, gosh, I can't eat a carnivore diet if I have a uric acid problem because uric acid is in red meat. Well, it turns out that, Dr. Saladino talks about this, and you should watch his videos. There's a long explanation of how it isn't just the uric acid and the other foods that are other foods that contain uric acid. It's about how we metabolize and process those chemicals and acids and organic acids in our bodies. That's a lot based on how much insulin resistance we have, how much plant materials and anti-nutrients we have, and how much protein and fat we have, and whether we're fat adapted or keto adapted. If you want to know about keto adapted versus fat adapted, look at Dr. Stephen Finney's work with Jeff Volek. They do a fantastic long explanation of that chemistry if you care. Some of you are really into that, and I'll get to that later if I have time. But right now, my whole point is lectins, low carbohydrate, low sulfur, histamine, salicylate, oxalate, and uric acid. These are the most common ones that people have to combine together, and there is no single book that shows you how to do that except perhaps a ketogenic or carnivore type diet or carnivore-ish diet. If you are a person with serious health problems and you're vegan or vegetarian, you can do vegan or vegetarian keto, and you can use various binders to bind to the different food lectins that you're forced to eat. You can also use a pressure cooker to deal with the foods that have lots of lectins because that will reduce the intensity of those lectins. So there's some hope for you if you're vegetarian or vegan and you've heard all this wonderful news about carnivore diets and you're like, what about me? How do I do this? And so look for keto books and techniques on how to do keto vegan and keto vegetarian. I'll end by saying that even Dr. Saladino says that on the carnivore diet, you're eating animal products, but you're also eating honey, which is an animal product, and a carb. And he says that whole fruit, berries, fructose is safe. And I also believe that Dr. Robert Lustig talks about this, and Dr. Jeff Volek and Stephen Finney all talk about the idea that a little bit of carbs sometimes is okay because we need to have some insulin response once in a while, and we can't go without carbs completely. There's a little bit of carbs in animal flesh, but not enough sometimes. And so please listen to those doctors about how we don't have to look at all carbs and all fruit as all bad all the time. But if you've got a fungal problem, you may have to avoid fruit, or a candida problem, you may have to avoid fruit. Fructose can be a problem for some people, but it's less of a problem in raw whole fruits, and you want to keep it below 25 grams a day for most people. So I hope this helps you. It's a hard answer because it doesn't give you an easy answer. It says you're going to have to slog it out with all the different cookbooks, and even though I'm a doctor and a chef, nobody's done it. The closest that's come is the Carnivore Code by Dr. Paul Saladino.